does this German cartoon character have to do with our understanding of ADHD?
Here a knife and there a fork? Philip, this is cruel work.
Something's about to change in the world of ADHD, and it's been a long time coming. ADHD as a term has been around for a while, yet no one seems to like it. We know that there is so much more to the struggle than just not being able to pay attention, but the only thing the world of psychiatry has given us is this label: attention deficit disorder. How are we supposed to tell people that we can't just will ourselves into being normal if we have to wear this label around that invites people to tell us, why don't you just try paying attention more? And this is what we end up talking about when it comes to ADHD in the workplace. Do I talk about my ADHD diagnosis? Being open about our diagnosis can get us support, but it can also invite stigmas. We might actually get useful things that can help us. We might also invite people to think that we're just being lazy and that we should just get over it. So we're gonna do a deep dive into some of the changes that may be coming to rename ADHD and how that might help us to better communicate this, even when it comes to colleagues who don't accept it. Disclosing an ADHD diagnosis in the workplace is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, sharing your diagnosis can lead to getting more support and resources to help you be more productive and to thrive in the workplace. It can also just lead into stigmas and misconceptions. Colleagues might interpret your symptoms as laziness or lack of effort, impacting your professional relationships and your ability to advance. So you have to weigh the risks of getting the support you need and the risk of negative judgments and biases. But maybe we should take a step back. Like, how did we even get here? How did we get this term ADHD? And why are we still using it today if no one likes it? Our story begins in the late 18th century. In 1798, Scottish physician Sir Alexander Crichton described what he called mental restlessness in his medical textbook.
When born with a person, it becomes evident at a very early period of life and has a very bad effect inasmuch as it renders him incapable of attending, and what is very fortunate, it is generally diminished with age.
This early reference described what we can now account as the signs of ADHD that we know today. Crichton described what he observed as an inability to pay attention, and it was one that appeared more often in younger individuals. Remember that this is right on the heels of the Victorian era, so this is impressive how accurate he is here. The Victorian era is when you have leeches and bloodletting and the humors and black bile and green bile and whatever. All these kind of medical history embarrassments, a lot of experimentation during this period, not a lot of science. But anything resembling ADHD was still a long way from hitting the public. That is until about 50 years later in 1845, with the introduction of Fidgety Phil by German author Heinrich Hoffmann. So Fidgety Phil appeared in a number of these children's stories where he would exhibit these undesirable behaviors, and then he would suffer consequences as a result. So here's a well-known scene of Phil sitting at the dinner table with his parents, and then it leads to this chaotic scene because Fidgety Phil couldn't sit still and everything off the table just fell off of it, and it created this awful situation.
Where is Philip? Where is he? Fairly covered up, you see? Cloth and all are lying on him. He has pulled down all upon him. What a terrible to-do. Dishes, glasses snapped in two. Here a knife and there a fork. Philip, this is cruel work. Table also bare. And poor papa and poor mama look quite cross and wonder how they shall have their dinner now.
The tale is meant to be a cautionary tale to illustrate the importance of good manners and self-control at the table. So obviously we're not seeing a lot of, say, neurodiversity acceptance at this stage in history, maybe unsurprisingly. Then we fast forward to about 1902, and there was this British pediatrician named Sir George Still, and he was publishing these lectures that were about children who appeared to have an inability to pay attention or to have self-control, but otherwise they had normal intelligence. And it was at this point that these are some of the first clinical descriptions of what we now know of as ADHD. But Still's lectures would fade into the background for the next 30 years until there was a new term that came about that was starting to frame this as more of something actually wrong with the brain. During the 1930s and 1940s, This became known as minimal brain dysfunction. And then into the 1950s and 1960s, this is where you see this term kinetic impulse disorder. So this latter term is focusing more on hyperactivity. This is also the point at which we start to see methylphenidate enter the scene, being prescribed as a medication, better known as its common name, Ritalin. It was actually first introduced in the 1950s to treat narcolepsy, depression, and fatigue. In the 1960s, it began to be used for ADHD, and it became a common medication for this symptom. It was in the 1970s that the term attention deficit disorder, ADD, was actually entered into the DSM-3. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And it was entered with two subtypes, with and without hyperactivity. So think about this for a second. We are still using a term that we came up with about 50 years ago. Then in 1987, it was called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So the hyperactive subtype was actually formalized into the name, and this was in the DSM-3R. And the change was meant to reflect that hyperactivity issues are not always present, but the central part of the disorder was attention. And then in 1994, we get the DSM-4 that classified ADHD into three subtypes: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, and combined. So this categorization helped to give us a more nuanced understanding of the disorder. And finally, in 2013, we get the DSM-5. And in this one, they maintain these three subtypes, but they emphasize that the symptoms have to be present before the age of 12. So this is what we have today. We still have the three subtypes, and we still have this label that keeps the deficit of attention as a primary focus point of the term. So we've come a long way since Fidgety Phil, but have we reached the end of our journey? Are we going to stick with ADHD much longer? Are there any discussions about renaming? So I did some research, and I actually found there are quite a few prominent figures who are arguing that yes, we should rename this thing. Definitely. And I wanted to look at a few of them. So first you have Dr. Russell Barkley, and this might be a name that you recognize because his videos are all over YouTube, and I highly recommend it. Some really interesting lectures if you have ADHD, or even if you have somebody with ADHD in your life. I think they are just really eye-opening, and they allow you to better navigate the disorder.
I call ADHD the Rodney Dangerfield of psychiatry because it gets no respect. And the reason it gets no respect is that the name trivializes what is a very serious disorder. When people hear you have an attention deficit, nobody compares that and says, oh, that's as bad as bipolar disorder, manic depression, or schizophrenia. And it can't be as bad as major depression or generalized anxiety or many of these other things, but it's actually worse than those.
His argument is basically that we should be renaming this to better focus on the executive functioning part of this disorder.
It's just that the name trivializes these underlying problems. And that's why I said if I could rename it, I would, and give it a more serious name like self-regulation disorder. Whereas when you say, oh, I've just got ADHD, people tell you to get some sleep, maybe take some ginkgo or some omega-3/6, have some more coffee, go to Starbucks, and get out of the way.
So Dr. Barkley is arguing for a name that better reflects the issues with self-regulation and executive functioning, rather than just tossing it across the room as an attention deficit. There's also Dr. Benjamin and Sarah Chayette, who argue that the term ADHD is misleading and just stigmatizing. So they're suggesting terms that better reflect the core nature of the disorder rather than it being this kind of deficit. The terms that they've put forth is like attention regulation disorder, or focus and impulsivity regulation disorder. And what I like about this is that it's really focusing on the challenges and being able to regulate things, as opposed to just an inability to pay attention and just totally not being in control of yourself.
By 1980, I thought I understood what ADHD was. What is this ADD? It was called ADD back then. They didn't have the H, and there were the...
Dr. Tom Hartman also wants to rename the disorder to focus more on like the positive benefits of this. So for example, like creativity and problem solving. And like others, he's trying to reduce the stigma. He thinks that by reframing the disorder, it can also just better communicate some of the strengths that come with having ADHD. There's also Stephen Hinshaw, who has argued for terms that focus more on the positive impacts of ADHD, focusing more on the cognitive strengths that come with it.
It's an attention deficit. It's an executive function deficit. ADHD is a multifaceted point on a continuum.
He wants to put a focus on the innovative potential of somebody with ADHD rather than just making it all about what's wrong with them, with us. And lastly, there's Dr. Edward Hallowell, who is a psychiatrist and ADHD researcher, and he wants a name that better reflects the unique cognitive style of someone with ADHD.
For as long as I can remember, I've been looking for a better term for ADHD than ADHD. It's the acronym VAST. And what I love about it is, first of all, the condition is vast. And it really imparts the vastness of this condition. Most important variables, attention and stimulus.
VAST, V-A-S-T, variable attention stimulus trait. And it's meant to reflect more of the fluctuations of attention and the ability to thrive in stimulating environments. By the way, have you noticed that among all of these renamings, there's not one of those 4 words that everybody is agreeing upon? Not one of them actually makes it across all of those renamings. Not attention, not deficit, not hyperactivity, and not disorder. None of them. Are we really on the verge of a renaming? Just look at what it took to update the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, and you'll see how renaming this, at least anytime soon, is uncertain. So between 4 and 5 stood 19 years. During that time, there was extensive research and task forces and work groups, professional and public input, field trials, consensus building, and an approval process. So the DSM-5 wasn't released until 2013. So let's just say we waited that same 19 years. That means we wouldn't see the DSM-6 released until 2032. By the way, this is to say nothing about the public lexicon and public acceptance catching up to this, right? So take, for example, autism, right? Before the DSM-5, this was the term. And in the DSM-5, they introduced this new term, autism spectrum disorder. And the idea was that if you had autism, you were actually somewhere on the spectrum. And while some people started to say on the spectrum or ASD, you still hear people using the term autism. So even with the renaming of ADHD, I'm sure that term would still stick around even if there was an official entry in the DSM-6. And that's just how naming is. Names stick. We get used to them. But with all this considered, this still leaves the question, should you disclose your diagnosis at work? It's complicated, and it's also personal. And I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but I think it's important to weigh the benefits and the risks. Believe me, part of me just wants to tell you, yeah, of course you should talk about your ADHD at work. What do you have to lose? That's how you get support for it. You should be asking for support. It's good to ask for help. But the reality is that ADHD does have this stigma to it. And people believe, rightly or wrongly, that ADHD is just a made-up label. It's an excuse just for being lazy, that it can be taught out of you, that you can just will yourself out of it. People actually still believe this. I also want to tell you not to worry about what other people think of you. But let's be honest, in the workplace, it does matter. It matters what people think of you. You have a reputation to uphold. How you are viewed by your peers matters. They even have formalized rituals around this, right? 360 feedback, peer-to-peer feedback. They have formalized sessions where your peers will describe what it's like to work with you and what they think of you and what they think you need to improve on. And this is where a lot of these just listing of ADHD symptoms end up just being written out, is right in your personal review. I've even heard managers say of neurodivergent employees that they're just using it as a crutch, and that if they're really having issues in that area, that they can just get some training. I've actually heard this. And this is infuriating for me to hear, but it also means that person believes in a position of management that the only thing that is holding that individual back is themselves. Now, there's a lot that can go into another video about requesting accommodations and asking for support at work. But what I will say, just from my own personal experience, is that I don't actually find it necessary to just go around telling people with specificity that I have ADHD. Because actually what I find is more important is being able to communicate what your needs are. And communicating what your needs are is something you should be doing with or without ADHD. And sometimes that's just as easy as being very specific to say, I cannot perform at my best unless X, Y, and Z. This is just how my brain works. Now, if I feel it's right, if I feel confident, if I feel that there's also just like something tactically to gain by disclosing my diagnosis, I may still not actually just hand over my diagnosis, but I will get more specific on it. I think it's enough for them to know that I have a cognitive impairment that I am dealing with. I'm able to do my job, but it does require that certain things are in place, that I do have certain needs in order for me to effectively do my job. And you'd be surprised how managers often they take very well to that. As a manager, it's actually nice when people make it easy for you, right? When they can just put it on a platter and say, I am ready to do my job. I can do it well. These are my needs. They're all just in front of you. I can identify them and I'll do the work, but I need to be allowed to have these things. I think a lot of managers take very well to that. I also don't want to put forth that there is any kind of like magical phrasing that I can just give to you and everybody can copy it and repeat it exactly, and it's going to work in your organization. You do have to navigate your organization. You do have to feel things out. You have to get to know your management. You have to get to know your colleagues and find a way of communicating those things that is going to work with those people and in that setting. But again, more importantly than telling people what your diagnosis is, more importantly than just being specific about the cognitive this and that, is identifying what do you need. And in case you have a deer in headlights response to that, when I ask you that question, what is it you need? What do you need? What are your accommodations? Don't feel bad about that. That is very common and it's very normal. It is hard to actually isolate what your needs are. Our attention is often just focused on what is wrong with us. And the public is often helping us to keep our concentration on that. What's wrong with me? Why did that go so badly? What should I have done differently? How often do we actually think about what you need? And this is actually why I started this channel. I found there's a lot of great content on ADHD. Believe me, I'm not the only person with an ADHD channel, but I didn't find a lot that was specialized around the workplace. And that's where I personally was having the greatest level of challenge. So I come here on a personal journey. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this, but I also want to leave something behind for the next generation so that other people can thrive too. I also think it's nice when someone can remind you that you're not going through this alone and that you've got people on your side. So if you are someone who struggles with ADHD, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. When I see people subscribe, it tells me that yes, there is an audience for this and that I should keep on making more videos. And so I try to post as often as I can to the level of quality and value that I think is required of this. And I hope this video was helpful to you as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I encourage you also to check out some of these other videos that I post on different subjects about ADHD in the workplace. Thanks for watching.